I think a lot of GMs have the idea that in order to run their game successfully, they need to keep campaign secrets close to the vest. Campaign secrets are volatile, after all, and if even one of them leaks out, it has the potential to spoil an entire story that the GM has planned. If players find out even one of these secrets before it's time, it could ruin the whole experience. Instead of a long-term epic adventure with lots of twists and turns, the players could just skip to the end. They fight the bad guy and win the day. There would be no real payoff to that kind of a story. In a way, I think this is true. You want to give your players a little bit of information at a time in order for it to be digestible. The players need to spend time gathering information so that they can make sense of the story. A GM's ability to facilitate this has to do with timing, knowing when and where to add to a narrative. And I'm going to tell you a story today that happened fairly recently where I feel like I had failed to properly utilize good timing, even though I hadn't really and was probably just being too hard on myself. Hello everyone, my name is Ian from Incendium RPGs, and today I'm going to be telling you guys a story about when I spilled the beans of my campaign and one way I went about recovering from it. But first, it's time for our subscriber roll-off. We're going to make a contested persuasion check. I'm going to roll my d20 and you roll yours, and whoever has the higher number wins the check. If I win, then you guys have to subscribe. And if you win, well, I guess I'll catch you on the next one. The Mossy Agate die. Gold numbers and a fine mix of green and white. This is the perfect die for rangers and druids, in my opinion. Ahaha! A 17. See if you guys can beat that one. Story time. This story takes place in my custom world of Corsara, an arcane punk style setting where the players are part of an international organization known as the Corsaran Marshals. They essentially serve as peacekeepers of the continent and have a certain international authority wherever they go. They received their assignment from HQ to act as a security detail on the Elucidator, which was carrying important alchemical supplies to the port city of Antoir. On the ship, there were plenty of people for them to interact with. There was a seasick captain, a by-the-books first mate, and a roguish cook. The cook was in fact a member of my world's Assassin's Guild, which had joined the ship's crew a little while back. You can see I drew a little bit of inspiration from Treasure Island here.
Easy, Jim. Till all in good fun.
Beyond just the NPCs though, this was the second session of this party, and they spent a good deal of the session just talking to each other. Almost 2 hours had passed before they decided to even interact with any of the NPCs that I had planned for them. And any good GM knows that when the party decides to do this, you do not get in their way. The ship arrived at the supply depot on one of the many islands in the region's archipelago. It was night, so the party decided to camp and rest up before heading out the next morning. While they socialized by the fire, they were attacked by a group of cloaked figures, TM. The foes charged from the woods, wielding sickles and lanterns from which they could essentially cast burning hands. I was pretty proud of these little guys. They weren't an especially challenging fight, but it was pretty fun to play with them. A particularly memorable attack from one of them involved opening up their lantern and breathing into it, kind of mimicking a dragon's fire breath, which of course was a little bit of foreshadowing on my part. When the ambuscade had been subdued, the party took the time to reveal the faces of their assailants. Kobolds, who only spoke an archaic version of Draconic, which only one of the party members could understand. The kobolds accused them of stealing the bones of their god, a long-dead red dragon from the Grave of Fire. And it was at this point that the party realized the cook assassin had disappeared back to the ship. Putting two and two together, the marshals returned to the ship and confronted her in the cargo hold. This cook assassin was essentially a beefed-up barbarian, and fortunately the party was well equipped with many control spells in order to deal with her. They threw her in the brig and brought her back to the port city. It was only later they would find out that she had killed the captain. Sounds pretty good so far, doesn't it? When I wrote up this session, I wanted to leave a lot of lingering questions that needed to be answered in the next one, as in who took the bones and why. This would make the follow-up session a mystery quest, involving lots of social interaction and a combat to round things off. Again, I had a cast of characters lined up for the parties to interact with. The first mate, now captain of the Elucidator, the alderman of the Elder Council of Antoir, whose responsibility it was to solve this crime, the criminal herself, the cook assassin, and an imperial inspector from a neighboring region who was there on matters of international security. In the opening scene of the next session, the party interacts with the alderman first. He interviews them, trying to learn as much as he can about what happened on the island. The marshals, for their part, are suspicious of him and think that Antoir had something to do with the theft of these dragon bones, but they don't have any proof just yet. After some discussion, the alderman tells the party that they are not to speak with the crew of the Elucidator, for that is now a crime scene, and any tampering they do on the ship will interfere with that investigation. Now, as a GM, I thought that this would provoke some sort of "you can't tell me what to do" attitude from the party. I mean, when has a D&D party ever listened to authority, right? Well, in this case, a lot of the characters are extremely cautious and didn't want to incite any international incidents by going against the alderman's wishes. Instead of going to talk with the first mate in secret, they find a loophole in what he said. He hadn't mentioned anything about speaking with the criminal, had he? They intimidate their way past the prison's guards and find the cell of the prisoner. Surprisingly, she's rather forthcoming with information. She tells them that she's part of an assassin's guild of sorts, which she refers to as a family. She explains the special tattoo that marks each member of this family, and that they're run by a mysterious patron known only as the Mother. Lastly, she mentions a little girl in the town of Emberlight who has also been marked with this tattoo, and may be joining their family all too soon. While all this is going on, I decide that it's probably a good time to introduce a brand new NPC to the party, which is a little bit of a dubious move on my part as the GM. The Imperial Inspector arrives with the Alderman in tow, and discovers the party is trying to interrogate this prisoner, and succeeding. A member of the party moves to intercept them so that the interview can continue, and the Alderman is particularly irate at their presence. The Inspector, for his part, seems somewhat bemused. Just as the alderman tries to push past the party member, there's a loud explosion from outside the doors of the prison. And a moment later, before anybody can really interact, the door is blown open, its reinforced steel crashing to the ground, and a series of several crystal golems enters the room. And that's where we left the session off. Now, you're probably wondering why this video is called Spilling the Beans. After all, that sounded like a really exciting session filled with suspense and intrigue, but I didn't really feel that way at the time. I have a tendency to write my sessions with a lot of dense information, and to mitigate this, I also write up a lot of social encounters to convey that information as easily as possible, so that my players don't get overwhelmed. Usually, this does a fairly good job of organizing it all. When I had originally written this session, I expected the cook, assassin, criminal to be the last person that the parties actually spoke to. Like I said, I thought they would go to the first mate and defy the alderman's orders. In hindsight, I could have had the inspector NPC show up a little bit earlier, and this could have remedied the situation a lot. But I didn't think of that, and so we got what we got. By the time the inspector had shown up, I felt like I had completely spoiled the campaign. I improvised my way through that interrogation. Instead of making it challenging, maybe involving a few contested skill checks or, deductive reasoning on the part of the players, I answered every single question without hesitation. In fact, I only answered one question, and that led to all of the other information being exposed. Why were you on the Elucidator? That's why the cook assassin was so forthcoming, which I explained away as her taking a shine to the party, for whatever reason. All it had taken was that single question, and I panicked. If you go onto YouTube and search for videos that involve giving advice to GMs, especially first-time GMs, a lot of them will usually end up saying something along the lines of, "Don't panic. After all, as long as your players are having fun, then you've done your job as the GM." And I tried not to panic, But after the session was over, I could really feel this knot of anxiety building up in my stomach. I felt like I had given the players and myself storytelling whiplash. I convinced myself that the session had been terrible, and sometimes I still struggle with how I ran that session. But when I asked about it, everyone seemed fine. Sure, it wasn't my best session that I've ever run, but nobody was mad or disappointed. It was just me. And that's when I began to understand exactly why I felt upset. As the GM, I have perfect knowledge of the campaign. And on paper, I'm willing to accept that there will be differences in what I had originally envisioned and what the players ultimately choose to do. After all, this is D&D, not a straightforward video game. But in practice, I felt like I had given away critical information to the campaign's plot, and that this was somehow an unforgivable mistake on my part as the GM. But here's the thing, that was only the third session. That's right, we try to play once a month, but it had only been about 2 sessions when I had come up with the master plan of my entire campaign. And because of this, I was really excited to see it to its conclusion. I was looking so far into the future of the campaign that I had forgotten to focus on what was going on right now. And that is to say, barely anything had happened yet. All of this means that things really aren't as bad as I thought. There are still some changes that I felt like I had to make. I feel like this part of the video is probably the least important, to be honest. It'll probably be the shortest too, but I still felt like it was important to share with you guys what I decided to do. Once I accepted that my campaign could continue, I felt better, and I was ready to try again. I looked at the facts that I presented to my players. Maybe I didn't need to assign so much weight to them after all. Again, I tend to present a lot of dense content to my players. Reorganizing this information would help make it more digestible and move the game forward at a smooth and steady pace. Like I said, it's about timing, so I made some lists for myself. One labeled antagonists, including the BBEG, one labeled allies, and one labeled key facts that I wanted my players to uncover over time throughout the course of the campaign. I already knew where I expected the campaign to end up, but as it stood, that just didn't feel like an option yet. So what I did was I added intermediate steps to the story. As a GM, my campaigns tend to have really high stakes, even when the players don't know it yet. World-ending stakes. So I asked myself, what can I do with these puzzle pieces that makes sense, but doesn't require the world to end quite yet? I decided to re-examine the storytelling tips that John and I have talked in the past, both here on the YouTube channel and on our podcast, Dragonmind. I restructured my campaign into 3 arcs instead of just 1. For the first arc, I only need 1 antagonistic faction, the family that the Cook assassin spoke of. This reduced the scope of the arc significantly, and immediately took the pressure off of the facts that I had spilled onto my players unintentionally. It will allow my players and I time to explore the themes buried within that faction. And the BBEG can still be a part of it, just not as I expected them to be. You guys probably could have guessed this, but a lower stakes campaign is probably the better way to start when running something in your custom world. Originally, when I started writing this video, I thought it would be about what you should do when something like this happens to you. But as I went through it and reiterated on the subject, I realized it was more of a lesson in being a game designer, a game master, and an artist in general. I don't know about you guys, but I am definitely my own worst enemy. I work hard on running campaigns that feel satisfying to my friends, and get frustrated when it doesn't turn out that way. When things go wrong, I take it very personally. I beat myself up, and I say to myself, if only I had done this, I would be a good game master. And nobody should talk to themselves that way. As we say in the martial arts, mastery is a process, not a state of being. And even though you might understand on paper what makes for a great campaign, it requires failing at those things to really understand why those pieces of advice are good. It takes a lot of practice to navigate creative hurdles skillfully. As a GM, I knew this going in, but it's one thing to give advice and another thing to follow it yourself. We don't learn when we succeed, we learn when we fail. So what about those other 2 arcs? I don't really know yet, but I have some basic ideas. I just don't think it's time to make anything concrete just yet. I'll get there when I get there, and so will you. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will catch you guys next time.